Just what is a woman? This question has long been debated in academic circles, among those paid to theorize. But recently, as the trans movement has gathered pace, it's entered general circulation, not as a discussion point, but as a weapon on whose sharp point everyone risks being caught, from Supreme Court nominees in the United States to senior politicians everywhere. In March, in the wake of the record-breaking wins of trans woman Leah Thomas on a women's swim team at the University of Pennsylvania, President Biden's nominee, Ketanji Brown Jackson, was challenged to define woman at her Senate hearing. She refused, saying she wasn't a biologist. That same week, Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper dodged the question in an interview, saying she wanted to, quote, avoid going down rabbit holes. There was an explosion of indignation on both right and left, with many feeling that women were being erased in both word and concept, and with it, their rights too. Indeed, the question of whether trans women should compete in sport against biological women has driven the question of what a woman is to fever pitch, and earlier this month, the Equality and Human Rights Commission weighed in. New guidelines have reasserted the definitional importance of biology and the lawfulness of biological women-only spaces, such as hospital wards and changing rooms. And Boris Johnson said he doesn't think, quote, biological males should be competing in female sporting events. I personally think that's right. And as someone who believes that biology does create a fundamental difference between trans women and born women, I've been asked to write articles condemning the perceived foolery of those reluctant to define what a woman is. I have done so. After all, there is a hostility, a seeming erasure of women, in the reluctance to use or define the W word. There's the worrying implication that female biology, once the hallmark of feminism, is nothing next to gender identity. There's the unfairness of letting a once niche gender ideology rob biological women of hard-won fairness in sports. And on one level, it seems utterly obvious what a woman is. And yet, I have not been wholly comfortable piling on the indignation at those who refuse to define woman. A voice niggles, insisting, wait a minute, women are not some pat thing, and defining a woman can and perhaps should be fiendishly complicated. Over the past few weeks, I've repeatedly asked myself how I'd answer the question if put on the spot, and the truth is that I'd struggle. Would I say a woman is a person with 2 X chromosomes? This sounds reductive and possibly inaccurate, as it may exclude intersex women. Would I say it's a person who can bear children? Not all women can bear children. What about someone with ovaries, a womb, and the rest? Sure, but then what about women who have had those removed, or in some cases, were born without them? Are they still women? Or is it about the way women relate to men? Surely not, since the wide range of women's sexuality precludes any one set of relationships there. Is there then a woman's essence? But there is trouble there too, as history shows. For millennia, there was certainty that there was a woman's essence, or nature, with authors, usually male, expounding on the topic. Male doctors keenly diagnosed and treated women's many supposed nervous conditions, such as hysteria, often cruelly. And alongside the psychoanalytical theorizing of Freud and Jung, works about women's so-called nature continued to appear. In the mid-20th century, the question was taken up by feminists. In 1949, Simone de Beauvoir asked in Volume 1 of The Second Sex, "What is a woman?" The answer wasn't brief. De Beauvoir wrote that motherhood had enslaved women to their bodies and traced women's social oppression to their reproductive oppression, as well as to Greek thought that associated women with chaos and darkness, and men with light and order. In 1963, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique carefully exploded the idea that women were innately suited to domesticity and men to careers. This was the starting gun for second-wave feminism. The question reappeared in a new form in the 1980s, producing 2 new strands in feminist thought: difference and sameness feminism. it wasn't that women should be limited by biology, but difference feminists argued that there was something innately different about women. Sameness feminists, by contrast, insisted that the sexes were fundamentally the same, with only superficial differences that had been amplified by patriarchal society, an echoing of de Beauvoir's idea. Clearly, then, what a woman is and how we think about that question is a complicated business, with a complicated history and complicated outcomes. The bitter debate about trans women versus women is a debate about the meaning and realness of biology. And yes, biological difference matters, sometimes hugely. It is certainly real. But there is room for nuance. Indeed, there is a necessity for it. Without it, I fear a relapse into arguing that women are defined by their biology beyond the swimming pool or the cycling track or the locker room. There is also the risk of forgetting real progress, which means that the importance of biology has diminished as women have gained more opportunities and freedoms. The horizons of women in some parts of the world are far less circumscribed by our capacity to bear children or by old ideas about fragile feminine brains. And that is obviously a good thing. Perhaps, then, the real problem is that while we may think we know a woman when we see one, there is just no satisfying way to define us. This, at any rate, is where we seem to have been led by feminist thought since the 1980s, when the idea of a cohesive category of women began to plague activists and scholars alike. Could gay and straight women, black and white women, Western and women from the developing world, working class and rich women really be said to have more in common than they didn't? The answer seemed to be no, causing the once electrifying notion of sisterhood, along with the movement itself, to buckle. New complexities had overtaken old certainties. In universities, a new framework was gaining popularity: gender. As a gender, rather than a sex, women existed alongside men and minorities and everyone else within what academics called a framework of power relations. Gender helped dislodge any remaining idea of universality from womanhood. It also opened the way for another new coinage you've almost certainly heard of, but perhaps wish you hadn't: intersectionality. Intersectionality declared that women were not some unified whole, but, like all people, composites of different so-called oppressions. And then came the publication in 1990 of Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, which boldly argued that sex and gender were one and the same, each just a social construct. Flash forward 20 years, and Butler's out there book has become the Bible of the age, one in which many seem convinced that there is, after all, nothing fixed or real about womanhood. This is what people like me are supposed to be enraged about. And I am upset. I am upset that Butler's ideas have been so misapplied, that instead of remaining a playful philosophical experiment, they ended up wielding real power over real women's lives. I am sad at how dangerous it feels to draw the line between political correctness and reality, that men and women are different, that biology matters in certain contexts. And I am worried that the zeal for not trampling on the needs of trans or would-be trans people, right-thinking as that is, has at the same time jeopardized some of the rights to safety and fairness of biological women. But I am also upset by the lack of willingness on the other side, my side as it were, to see that, as the history of feminism itself makes clear, gender and sex are genuinely complicated. That overconfident or oversimplified definitions of woman, which apparently we're all supposed to be able to produce, can be limiting and crude, not just in relation to trans women, but biological women too. The culture wars demand simple takes on complicated ideas, but womanhood is not a simple matter. There are simple principles at stake in the current debates over trans rights: fairness to trans women, but not at the expense of biological women, ethical decency, and freedom of speech. But there is nothing simple about the kind of thinking required to actually enshrine them.